Edward Collins adjusted his navy blue tie for the last time that morning, glancing at his reflection in the glass door of Whitmore Industries. 25 years of unwavering loyalty, countless weekends surrendered to urgent projects, and late-night reports rushed under deadlines. He had given everything to this towering monument of steel and ambition. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with its usual polished chaos. Polished shoes clacked against marble floors. Junior analysts sprinted past, balancing coffee cups and files. Edward's presence was acknowledged with brief nods, a silent respect reserved for veterans like him. He made his way to the executive floor, where a scheduled meeting with Arthur Whitmore, the company's elusive CEO, awaited. Edward felt a twinge of anxiety. Meetings with Arthur were rare and seldom casual. The secretary, a young woman with icy blonde hair, gestured wordlessly towards the heavy oak door. Edward knocked once before entering. Arthur Whitmore sat behind a colossal mahogany desk, his sharp gray suit blending with the coldness of the room. His eyes, piercing and detached, rose from a document he barely bothered to hide. "Edward," Arthur began, his tone devoid of warmth, "I will be direct. As of this morning, your services are no longer required. Effective immediately." Edward stood frozen, the words hammering into him without mercy. "No warning? No explanation?" he managed to stammer, his voice cracking slightly. Arthur leaned back, his fingers steepled. "The board has decided to restructure. We appreciate your service, but the company must move forward. You will receive the standard exit documents at reception." There was no handshake. No thank you. Only a cold dismissal. Dazed, Edward exited the room. The secretary avoided his gaze. His colleagues, sensing the tension, buried themselves deeper into their screens. Edward walked towards the lifts, the world around him blurring into a senseless hum. Outside, the London drizzle had thickened. It soaked through Edward's coat as he wandered aimlessly, each step heavier than the last. 25 years. Erased in under 5 minutes. He reached a small cafe tucked between two office towers. The smell of burnt coffee and damp wood welcomed him. Sitting at a corner table, Edward ordered a black coffee and pulled out a notepad from his briefcase, the one habit he had never abandoned. As he scribbled furiously, the disbelief giving way to anger, a memory surfaced. An offhand comment made years ago by a departing colleague. Something about missing overtime payments. Something about hidden ledgers. Edward paused, the pen trembling between his fingers. What if his dismissal was not just corporate ruthlessness? What if it was meant to silence him before he saw too much? Outside, the rain pounded harder against the windows, as if urging him to dig deeper. Edward Collins realized that this was not the end of his story. It was only the beginning. The following morning, Edward returned to the cafe. His clothes still carried the dampness of yesterday's rain, and his eyes bore the restless bruises of a sleepless night. He sipped the bitter coffee, flipping through his old notepad, hunting for anything he might have overlooked. Dates, names, transactions. Everything that had once seemed routine now whispered of something darker. As the minutes crawled by, a shadow slid into the seat opposite him. It was Amelia Grant, once a fellow senior manager at Whitmore Industries, who had resigned quietly 2 years ago. She wore a charcoal trench coat and a knitted scarf, her face half hidden beneath the brim of her hat. "I heard what happened," Amelia said, her voice low and cautious. Edward narrowed his eyes. "Did you?" he asked, wary. "I left because of them," she murmured. "Not because I wanted to, but because I found something I was not supposed to see." Edward leaned forward. "Tell me everything." Amelia hesitated, glancing around the cafe. A couple argued quietly at a distant table, and the barista hummed tunelessly behind the counter. Still, she lowered her voice even further. "Arthur is not just restructuring," she whispered. "He is covering tracks. There is money being moved, contracts being hidden, offshore accounts, false audits. And anyone who looks too closely disappears." Edward felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked. "Because you have nothing left to lose," Amelia replied. "And because you might still have enough strength to fight back." She slid a flash drive across the table. "This is everything I managed to collect before I left." Edward picked up the small device, its weight suddenly monumental. "I have contacts," Amelia continued. People who can help. But you must move carefully. One wrong step, and you will vanish like the others. She stood to leave, her eyes scanning the street beyond the foggy window. Trust no one at Whitmore Industries, she warned. Not even the ones you think you know. Then, without waiting for a response, she disappeared into the gray morning. Edward sat alone, the flash drive burning in his palm. Outside, the rain had eased into a mist, blurring the city into a silent, watchful world. He knew now. He was not just fighting for justice. He was fighting to survive. The hidden ledger. That night, Edward sat in his small apartment, the blinds drawn tight and every light off except for a single desk lamp. The flash drive trembled slightly in his fingers as he inserted it into his old laptop. A folder appeared almost instantly, labeled simply, Ledger. He clicked it open. Rows upon rows of financial records, emails, secret contracts, and offshore bank transactions spilled onto the screen. Edward's heart raced as he scrolled. It was worse than he had imagined. There were shell companies linked to Arthur's inner circle. Fake consultancy fees paid out to non-existent firms. Donations to political figures. Even bribes disguised as charity work. Edward leaned back, overwhelmed by the sheer size of the deception. This was no simple fraud. This was a machine built to protect itself, consuming anyone who dared to stand in its way. Suddenly, a small alert popped up at the corner of the screen. Incoming message. Unknown sender. They are watching. Move. Edward froze. The message vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving no trace behind. A chill ran down his spine. Was it a warning? A threat? Or both? Without hesitation, Edward yanked the flash drive from the laptop, shoved it into his pocket, and grabbed his coat. He bolted from the apartment, not even bothering to lock the door behind him. The city outside was cold and sharp, neon lights blinking like distant beacons. Edward blended into the streets, moving fast but trying not to look like he was running. His mind raced. Where could he go? Who could he trust? He remembered Amelia's words, I have contacts. Edward ducked into a narrow alleyway and pulled out a crumpled note she had slipped into his pocket that morning. One name. One address. He stuffed the note back into his coat and kept moving, sensing, even without looking, that eyes were now following him. Above him, the windows of tall, indifferent buildings glittered like silent witnesses. He was alone, but he was not invisible. Tonight was no longer about gathering evidence. Tonight was about surviving until dawn. The safe house. Edward arrived at the address just before midnight. It was an old tailor shop tucked between two boarded-up cafes, its windows dusty and its sign barely legible under the flickering streetlight. He hesitated for a moment, glancing over his shoulder. The street was empty, but he could feel the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on him. He pushed the door open. A small bell above it gave a half-hearted jingle. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mothballs and old fabric. Bolts of cloth were stacked against the walls, and mannequins in half-finished suits stood like silent sentries. From the back room, a man emerged. He was short and wiry, with sharp eyes and an even sharper expression. His gray hair was slicked back neatly, and a tape measure hung around his neck like a medal of honor. You Edward? He asked, his voice low. Edward nodded. The man jerked his thumb towards the back. Come. Quickly. Without another word, Edward followed him through a narrow hallway and down a set of creaky stairs into a hidden basement. The room below was completely different. Banks of old computers hummed softly. Maps and documents lined the walls. There was even a small bed tucked into one corner. This is your safe house now, the man said, locking the door behind them. Name's Harris. Amelia sent you? Edward handed him the flash drive silently. Harris plugged it into one of the computers and his eyes flicked rapidly over the files. A low whistle escaped his lips. Arthur's been busy, he muttered. Edward sat down heavily on a metal chair. Busy enough to kill for it, he said. Harris looked at him sharply. You're not wrong. He spun the chair around and leaned in close. They'll be looking for you. They already are. Edward's chest tightened. I figured. Harris tapped the screen. Good news is, with this, we can hurt them. Bad news is, we have to move fast. Edward nodded. The exhaustion in his bones outweighed only by the fire growing in his chest. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was preparing to strike back. As Harris worked through the night, Edward sat silently, gathering his strength. Somewhere above them, the city moved on, oblivious to the small, hidden war brewing beneath its feet. Tomorrow, Edward knew, everything would change. And this time, it would be Arthur who would have to run. Dawn broke gray and sullen over the city. In the safe house basement, Edward and Harris finalized their plan. Maps were spread out across the table, marked with red circles and cryptic notes. Screens flashed lines of code, surveillance footage, and building schematics. Harris stabbed a finger at a blueprint. This is the server farm where Arthur keeps his backups. We take it out, we cripple him. Edward leaned closer. And the other locations? Harris nodded grimly. Money laundering fronts. Safe deposit boxes. If we hit them all at once, he won't know where to run. Edward inhaled slowly, feeling the gravity of what they were about to do. You'll need a team, Harris said. Edward shook his head. No. Just tell me what to do. Harris raised an eyebrow but said nothing. There was a certain madness in Edward's eyes now. A man who had nothing left to lose. By midday, Edward was moving. Armed with fake IDs, burner phones, and a car Harris had borrowed, he set out across the city. First stop, an office tower on the east side, gleaming and heartless. Edward walked in through the revolving doors, dressed like any other tired executive. No one gave him a second glance. He rode the lift to the 34th floor. In a janitor's closet, hidden behind a false wall, was a relay server feeding Arthur's private network. Edward found it, pulled the drive Harris had given him from his coat, and plugged it in. A few keystrokes, a quiet beep, and the virus was loosed. One down. He was back in the car before the first alerts even started. Next, a bank on Park Crescent. This time, it was a safe deposit box filled with hard drives, carefully encrypted and hidden under a false name. Edward used an access code Harris had procured. Inside the vault, the box was heavy. Edward smashed the drives against the steel table, shards scattering across the floor. Two down. As he slipped back onto the street, Edward felt a change in the air. A ripple of tension. Someone, somewhere, was waking up to what was happening. He couldn't stop now. He wouldn't. Arthur had stripped everything from him. Today, Edward was taking it all back. Nightfall wrapped the city in its dark cloak. Edward stood atop a rooftop, overlooking Arthur's gleaming headquarters. The building was a fortress of steel and glass, pulsing with the false promise of power. In his earpiece, Harris's voice crackled. Are you sure about this? Edward smiled grimly. I'm already dead to them. Below, lights flickered as the virus spread through Arthur's systems. Security doors locked. Elevators froze. Cameras blinked out one by one. Inside, Arthur was trapped, raging at shadows he could not see. Edward moved quickly. He descended through the emergency stairwell, slipping past the confused guards, all their comms dead. At the 15th floor, he found the executive suites, abandoned in a panic. Edward kicked open the heavy oak door at the end of the corridor. Arthur stood there, backlit by the chaos beyond the windows, phone pressed uselessly to his ear. Their eyes met. For a moment, time itself seemed to hold its breath. Edward stepped forward. Hello, Arthur. Arthur lowered the phone slowly. His face twisted into a sneer. You think this will save you? Edward's voice was calm. It's not about saving me. With one swift movement, Edward threw a flash drive onto Arthur's mahogany desk. The files inside, evidence of Arthur's embezzlement, blackmail, and betrayal, were already leaking onto the internet. Arthur lunged forward, but Edward was faster. He slammed the door shut behind him, locking Arthur inside. Sirens howled outside now. Police. Regulators. Reporters. Edward turned away, walking down the corridor as the building behind him began to implode. Not with fire, but with truth. The reckoning had begun. And it was merciless. Arthur's empire crumbled faster than anyone had imagined. In less than 24 hours, headlines blared across the city. Corporate kingpin exposed. Arthur Langley's dark empire unraveled. Shareholders panicked. Investigators flooded the building. His once loyal executives disappeared like smoke on the wind. In his glass prison, Arthur watched helplessly as the world he had built on fear and deceit was stripped away piece by piece. Edward, meanwhile, moved silently through the city. He was a ghost now, unseen but unstoppable. At dawn, he met Harris at an old pier by the river. "You did it," Harris said, disbelief heavy in his voice. Edward only nodded. He stared across the water where the sun rose like a silent witness to the night's events. "It's not finished yet," Edward murmured. Somewhere deep inside, he knew that removing Arthur was only the beginning. The rot ran deeper, entwined through the city like a cancer. A black car pulled up near them. From it emerged Marianne Langley, Arthur's own sister, and Edward's secret ally. "Ready?" she asked. Edward gave a faint smile. "Always." Together, they would dismantle not just a man, but a system. One brick at a time. As they drove away, the first cries of a new day rose over the city. A city on the brink of change, born from betrayal, vengeance, and finally, justice. Edward closed his eyes. He was ready for whatever came next. The city was quieter than usual. Shadows of the old regime still lingered, but the heart of corruption had been cut out. Edward, Harris, and Marianne worked tirelessly behind the scenes. They rebuilt companies destroyed by Arthur's greed. They exposed the hidden players who had thrived in the darkness. They offered second chances to those who had been crushed under the old system. It was not easy. Threats still lurked. Some enemies, once loyal to Arthur, plotted in secret. But Edward had learned from the best, and from the worst. He anticipated every move. He dismantled every plot. At last, one evening, as rain drizzled over the city's glowing lights, Edward stood on the rooftop of his new headquarters. Below him stretched a city reborn. Marianne appeared beside him, her coat billowing in the wind. "You kept your promise," she said softly. Edward didn't answer immediately. He simply watched the streets fill with life, with hope, with something long thought dead. Then finally he spoke. "This is only the beginning." Together, they stared into the night, where the lights of 1,000 windows shimmered like stars. The past was behind them. The future theirs to shape. And as the first true dawn of the new city broke across the sky, Edward felt, at last, free.